This is the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast, a podcast brought to you by two physical therapists devoted to helping physical therapists and other healthcare providers become better educators to patients, students, the community, and each other by interviewing prominent and passionate people within the realms of healthcare and education. The Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast is intended literally for educational and entertainment purposes only. No clinical decision making should be based on only one source, and therefore this podcast should not be used as personal medical advice. While care has been taken to ensure accuracy, occasionally mistakes and factual errors can be present, as we are only human. This is our journey on the road to becoming better educators, so get ready with your pen and paper as class is about to begin. Hey everybody, this is Brandon, and from all of us here at HET Podcast, we'd like to thank all of our listeners and guests for their tremendous support throughout this process, and I'd like to take the opportunity to give a shout out to those who felt that they got enough value out of our podcast to write a fantastic review on iTunes recently, as they are Andrew Rothschild, Susie Gronsky, Jamie Lowy, and Perry Brubaker. So thanks to all for their reviews, and we'll continue to provide valuable content to all. Now, before we get to our interview with Brett Neilson, I'd like to take the time to announce that Dr. Scotty Butcher has released a strength and conditioning program and rehab mentorship program. Now, for those who aren't sure what this is a continuing education opportunity consisting of monthly webinars and or online lectures for advanced learning and education credits. Dr. Scotty Butcher offers ongoing mentorship and application of clinical strength and conditioning to daily practice by providing clinical scenarios and feedback on programming, coaching, cueing, and technique. Now, there is also a discussion forum to get your clinical questions answered by Dr. Scotty Butcher and a team of experts, aka the Jedi Council, on clinical strength and conditioning. One also has the ability to get feedback through video submissions and receive ongoing development of content based on their needs. Now, for those interested, please check out the link in our show notes to check out this online continuing education opportunity, as Dr. Butcher is a very prominent and respected researcher, professor, and clinician in the realm of strength and conditioning, and he's definitely going to provide some good stuff. Now, without further ado, on to the show. We're listening to the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast. I am one of two co-hosts. My name is Brandon Powen, and of course, I'm joined as always by my other half, F. Scott Fiel. And today we have a very special guest from Evidence in Motion. Today we welcome Dr. Brett Neilson, who is the Director of Admissions at Evidence in Motion, which, for those who don't know, is the largest provider of post-professional educational programs in the PT industry. Brett got his DPT from the University of Puget Sound in 2009, and he went on to complete EIM's orthopedic residency and fellowship programs, along with obtaining his therapeutic pain specialist certification through EIM and ISPI. Additionally, he is an EIM and ISPI faculty member, and for those who don't know what ISPI is, it's the International Spine and Pain Institute. He currently resides in Newcastle, Washington, and he is now working in Kent, Washington as the Residency Fellowship Director of Outpatient Physical Therapy, along with also being the Director of Admissions at EIM. So Brett, first of all, thanks so much for coming on the show tonight, man, as we're so excited to have you on. And I realize that I kept your bio pretty brief, but was there anything else that you'd like our listeners to know about you that we didn't mention in the intro here?
Yeah, Brandon, thanks for having me on the show here, and I really do greatly appreciate the opportunity to join you both this evening. I think you pretty much covered it. I think professionally, the only, just to maybe give some more context, is that I'm also very involved with my state association as well, and sit on the board of directors of the Physical Therapy Association of Washington. So just another kind of hat that I wear there. But otherwise, I think you pretty much covered it from a professional aspect. And I would say the only other personal kind of upcoming thing for me is welcoming child number 2 into the family within about a month. So lots is happening this fall.
Awesome, Brett. Congrats, man.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
Brett, can you tell us a little bit about your academic journey and how it led you to where you are today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll try to keep it rather brief. But so my academic journey started when I applied to, 4 different physical therapy schools, and wasn't really sure. I was starting to learn at that point how competitive it is to get into physical therapy school. And just thankfully, I was accepted into a program, that being the University of Puget Sound, and signed up without kind of almost sight unseen. And wow, that was a decision that I made kind of very nonchalant as I really wanted to go to PT school. But that decision there really shaped kind of my professional career and where I'm at today. So I was fortunate enough to have really awesome faculty. Dr. Bob Boyles came on board as our orthopedic instructor. And Bob really connected me with Dr. John Childs down in Texas. So how my whole professional journey really started was Bob kind of one day in clinic ran an idea by me and said, "Hey, I'm thinking of setting up this research internship with with John Childs down in Texas. Do you think anybody be interested in that?" And I kind of thought about it and I said, "Man, that sounds pretty cool." And I went back to him about a week later and I said, "Hey, what's the opportunity what's the chances of you setting that up for me? I might be interested." And again, this was towards the end of my DPT education, so I'd already fulfilled my internship requirements and was getting ready to graduate. But not knowing John back then, John will never turn down free labor. So of course, Bob and John really set that up. And after graduation, I went down to Texas, spent a couple months down there helping them with a large kind of randomized controlled trial. And that's kind of really what spurred me into getting my foot in the door with evidence in motion and the residency program, etc. Just my 2 months down there, I came back to Seattle. I started practicing for a company that's no longer around. They've been acquired. And anyways, I practiced in Seattle for a couple years and kept in touch with Dr. John Childs. And he had another study come about, needed somebody to run it. Evidence in motion was starting to grow. This was back in 2011. So I really went down there to run some research studies and really help EIM out on its kind of growth in the admissions as well as kind of business development side of things. And of course, I was also still in the clinic seeing patients on a part-time basis as well through all of this. So that led me down. I was in Texas for 5 years and did a number of different things down there, running a couple studies, opened up a physical therapy clinic for a sister company, and ultimately I ended up back with EIM on a full-time basis and moved back up to Seattle. So that's really been my professional journey. And of course, in there was, plugged in there was my residency training that I did through Evidence in Motion. And then ultimately I went in to do fellowship training beyond that. So those are some of just kind of, I guess, the big professional things that led me into some different directions and really what led me into some of my educational opportunities.
Awesome, man. Appreciate you sharing that. It's very helpful to hear. And Brett, we kind of like to jump in to this very highly debated topic as of late, and that's regarding mandatory residency. Now, I'm sure you've heard about, the PT Clinical Education Task Force that's kind of been researching that and kind of presented their recommendations relatively recently. And of course, there's going to be more decisions and stuff that are going to be made in the near future. But, kind of looking back on this, what is your opinion on making residency mandatory in this day and age?
Yeah, Brandon, that's a great question. And, I really approach that question from a couple different angles. And one, making physical therapy residency training mandatory sounds fantastic. From an idealistic world, if you will. It just makes a ton of sense that, we as physical therapists in a doctoring profession really start to mold to the medical model where once you are out into practice, you're continuing to learn through a structured program, if you will. So on paper that sounds fantastic, and from an ideal world I think that sounds fantastic. So I would definitely be in favor of making residency training mandatory from that side of the coin. But I think we also need to take a step back here when really looking at this question and really this debatable topic right now. So first, I'm really glad to see the APTA really putting together a strategic plan, if you will, on looking at this issue and how to shape PT education and really the practice of physical therapy going forward. But I do have kind of some concerns and reservations that really I guess maybe challenge whether I really truly believe this is the right direction for our profession. And it all comes down to, I think, variability in practice. I think we hear about variability in practice a lot. There's, published, people have been published in saying that variability in practice is a big issue in our profession and really within the healthcare system, and really the healthcare community. It's not just our profession. It's several other professions and really all professions within the healthcare. It's just this variability in practice. And so I think that really starts at entry-level education and really shoring up our entry-level education really before we get into post-professional education. So my concern is if we require residency to be mandatory of all, physical therapists who graduate from a CAPTE accredited program, is that how sure are we that all of our residency programs are very standard? Of course, we have ABTRE, the American Board of Physical Therapy Education, Residency, and Fellowship Education, and that provides some standards, but I think we're far from really standardizing residency across the board. And I think that's one of the big issues, is that if we are going to make it mandatory, we really need to have it be a little bit more standardized as to what's taught within those residencies and really make, some adjustments to what's, currently being taught in residency training. So I think that's one of the big issues. Another kind of big issue that sticks out is just residency placement and residency availability. I think there is this growing interest in students wanting to be placed into residency programs. And in fact, I spoke to a student earlier today who spoke on this issue, that there's just a shortage of places that they can go. So he was telling me he was looking at programs over on the East Coast, and a lot of programs take 1 student, 2 students, and some of them, might take a little bit more, 4 students. And really, I'm talking about some of the more traditional brick and mortar programs that have this only a small capacity to take students. But that's one of the big issues. And he brought up this point of, Brett, I'm applying with, who knows how many, 100, 150, 1,000 people for 1 or 2 slots. It's so competitive to get into a residency program, and I really want to do this. And what can I do to make myself more attractive? So I think that's one of the big issues, is that right now there's just not a plethora of residency spaces. Now, there are organizations like Evidence in Motion that offer more hybrid learning opportunities, combining online as well as on-site education, really to bring residency training to physical therapists, to allow them to do residency from any clinic that they choose. And this is a great way to expand the reach of residency training for physical therapists who are really dedicated to wanting to improve themselves. So I think those are a couple of the big issues, and of course there's several others that come down to I think some financial impact as well. And financial impact on the universities, financial impact on the residents, most importantly, as well as financial impact on APTA. So I think this is a really large issue that doesn't really have a single solution, and that it's really kind of multifaceted. And it's going to be something that, if this is the direction that the association chooses to move in, that it's going to be something that probably evolves over a long period of time, with a goal well into the future of making residency training mandatory. I think right now we're at maybe 5% of all new graduate physical therapists who come out and go into residency training. We're around 10% of physical therapists are specialist trained. So I think we've got a ways to go, and we really need to create and build the infrastructure first before we kind of make that a mandate. Hopefully that gives maybe some ideas from the way I see things from, kind of my positions and where I sit and some of the different hats that I wear.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Brett. And I think you brought up some really good points there, in that, the availability right now is not ready to handle a task such as that, and especially the financial aspects that you talked about as well. And another point as well that I thought of too, is that I fear that too, pushing students into a program, especially when the student's not necessarily sure which direction in their career they want to go, are we sending that student then therefore down, oh no, and now you have to be an ortho, now you have to be in neuro, And I think that's really good if the student knows that's what they want. But, I'm going to be honest, I thought I wanted one thing coming out of school, and then I totally switched my mind.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a really good point too. And, while I do think there's a huge value in specializing in the area of physical therapy, that you are wishing to practice in. And of course, you can always have multiple specialties and you can always switch specialties, but I do think there is something to having that extensive kind of deep dive and further development in that specific area. So I do think there is something to that. And then if maybe offer one additional thing is that, my advice to new students coming out, I do have the opportunity to speak to DPT students in several programs. And my advice is always, if you know what you want to do when you come out, choose a kind of dedicated, structured pathway. I really discourage new students from taking, a CE course from this organization and then bouncing over to take another CE course from another organization, and really just kind of taking CE courses from all over the place, because it's really hard, as a new clinician, it's really important for you to build your kind of clinical framework and foundation of how you are going to make decisions in clinical practice. And what I find with new grads who kind of dabble a lot is that they have a hard time really fitting all those pieces together. And if we look at the research, traditional education, where you go sit in class for for a weekend, 2 full days, and have somebody lecture at you for half the time and get your hands on and practice half the time, really has really poor translation into clinical practice. So I really encourage people to pick a structured kind of program, if you will, whether that be a residency, whether it be a certification. Financially, residencies can oftentimes be a burden to the student, and they can be a large expense, especially if they don't have an organization who's going to cover that expense for them. So oftentimes certifications might be a better way to go for that student. Certifications are oftentimes half the cost of residency training. And it's kind of a little bit more of a choose your own adventure. You get to, choose your mentors. You can do as much or as little mentorship as you need, while you kind of backfill that with some of the didactic content that you will find really useful to you in your clinical practice. On the flip side, if you're coming out of school not quite sure what direction you want to head in, then it might be okay to do some dabbling. And I would just say do dabbling in different specialty areas so that you can kind of figure out what direction you might want to head into. So that's kind of always my advice to new clinicians coming out.
Yeah, Brett, I think that's a really good point in that, I'll confess what I've been doing since I graduated is I initially did go more and I did dabble more just because I felt like there was so much I needed to learn. And what I kind of realized was before is if I actually just figured out how to actually reason clinically in terms of I know all these tools, but it's a matter of how do you incorporate that in to meet the person that you're seeing right in front of you. And that's where I find, at least for me, being able to self-reflect, that's not something that I got super strongly through my experiences in school. And not to say that that's the fault of the school. I mean, I'm not trying to say anything right there, but I think that was definitely my weakness. And I think that you're right that that's an important concept of it. So I think that's a good point, Brett.
Yeah, absolutely. Evolving clinical practice. So what you really spoke on are skills that you develop when you're in the clinic, and really, unfortunately for DPT education, that's where a lot of the variability does exist is in the clinical internship environment. So I think that's, and maybe we can touch on this a little bit later, but I think that is one of the areas that can be improved upon as we kind of move into the future and trying to maybe create a little bit more of a standard way in which that's done.
Yeah, for sure. And Brett, I'm going to backtrack a little bit and kind of ask a question I probably should have asked initially, but for our listeners who aren't sure, can you tell us kind of what's the difference between a residency and fellowship program?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's actually probably a question that I get most often, and I hear that question from new graduate PTs, I hear it from experienced PTs, I hear it from business owners, and I think there is a kind of a misconception or a misnomer of, what really is the difference, and do you have to do a residency if you want to do a fellowship, etc. So I'm just going to lay it out how I would normally do for somebody. And that is just comparing physical therapy to the medical model. So in the medical model, if we really kind of simplify it, you go to school to become a physician, and then upon graduation from medical school, you are placed into a residency. That residency helps you specialize in an area of medicine. So that could be in orthopedics, it could be, in cardiopulmonary, it could be in a lot of different areas, right? And then oftentimes, physicians will choose to go on to a fellowship program. And a fellowship program really is a deeper dive into one of those specialty areas. So it's a subspecialty in a specialty area. What you see is fellowships are really not mandatory for physicians, whereas residencies are. And I think that's the concept, as physical therapy is trying to move more to this medical model. So if you think about it, a physical therapist who graduates from a DPT program, they're graduating with, we'll call it a general set of skills, right? The NPT exam covers all various aspects of physical therapy, from neuro to pediatrics to orthopedics to cardiopulm, etc. A residency program is designed to help somebody specialize in one of those areas. So if you look at what type of residency programs exist, you'll see there's residency programs in orthopedics, which is by far the largest of all residency programs. There's residency programs in neuro rehab, residency programs in pediatrics and sports, and really the list goes on. There's a pretty long list of different types of residencies. So the residency program is designed to help you specialize in one area of physical therapy. And they're really designed for, entry-level clinicians and newer clinicians, or more experienced clinicians who are perhaps switching specialty areas as well and looking for that structured program that includes mentorship. A fellowship then is a deeper dive into one of those specialty areas. So a very common example that most people are aware of is the fellowship in manual therapy through the American Academy of Orthopedic Manual Physical Therapists, or AOMT. That's a subspecialty in manual therapy that lives under the umbrella of orthopedics. So it kind of goes in that order, from DPT education to residency and then on to fellowship. I think I quoted earlier, over 10% of people are specialist trained. Less than 1% of physical therapists have fellowship training. So it's a much smaller pool when you get up to fellowship training, because it's a little bit deeper dive into a very specific area. And then just kind of add one other thing. One of the misnomers is that you have to do a residency in order to do a fellowship, and that's actually not true in physical therapy. In physical therapy, you can go directly into a fellowship, although fellowships are typically not open to new graduates. Oftentimes, a new graduate needs to have a year of experience before they're eligible to move into a fellowship program at minimum. So that hopefully explains that.
Yeah, great insight on that, Brett. I appreciate you explaining that. What is the process for applying for a residency or fellowship? And I know you said it's a pretty competitive kind of endeavor. So do you have any recommendations to help improve one's chances of gaining acceptance into these programs?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's, again, one that I hear often is, how do I make myself attractive? How do I stand out for one of these residency positions? And it is true. A lot of residency programs take, they may train 1, 2, 3, or 4 residents per year, and they may have 100 plus apply for those spots. So those types of residencies, which I often refer to as kind of traditional residencies, or sometimes brick and mortar residencies, you'll typically find those types of residencies at academic centers, large hospital systems, typically. And in those types of residencies, they are highly competitive. And you want to, just like in searching for a new job, you want to make yourself as attractive to that residency as possible. So in those types of residencies, oftentimes they're taking into consideration your grades, so how well you did in school. So while your teachers may tell you that grades don't matter, and for the most part they don't when you get out into the professional world, but if you are trying to get into a highly competitive residency, that may be something that they are considering. Any awards or recognitions that you receive from your academic program. And I think that goes both for your traditional residencies as well as future employers in perhaps the private practice sector or hospital-based systems. That's another thing that can make you really attractive. professional involvement, so how involved you are with your profession. Did you hold any student positions within your kind of state student, maybe special interest group, or, AOMPS student group, or the APTA? So what other professional opportunities have you had the chance to be involved with, and how active are you with your profession is another thing that can really make you attractive. Another thing would be experience. So if you are trying to get into a very specific subspecialty area at a very competitive program, what is your prior experience? Do you have experience that creates the foundation in that specialty area for the fellowship program that you're applying to? That can be something that is also really important as you are considering the program and the competitiveness of it. And there's other intangibles too. I think the interview process is really important. If they are doing live interviews, and oftentimes they will, with a select number of candidates, how well you interview, your personality, how personable you are, because again, we're in a people first profession where you're going to be interacting with a lot of patients, and what's your ability to adapt and interact with different types of people, I think is also something that's more of an intangible that may not show up on your resume, but is something that could oftentimes be demonstrated through your exposure in an interview or in a job shadow type of interview process. So maybe those are some of the things that would help you stand out, but really, I would look at it from what would make me attractive to a future employer, because in those traditional programs, you are becoming an employee of that residency. So you want to, again, just make yourself stand out, through some of those different things that I mentioned. On the other side of the coin, you have more of the hybrid type of programs like Evidence in Motion. And one of the beauties of a program like Evidence in Motion is it's non-competitive, or very little competition. And that's because companies like Evidence in Motion, and I'm purely speaking about Evidence in Motion just because that's what I have extensive knowledge in as working for them as the admissions director. There are several other schools out there who offer very similar training opportunities for residencies, but those programs generally have a large faculty pool. They have well-defined design systems, and because you're not going to be an employee of the residency, so EIM does not employ any of their residents, they don't have necessarily a cap on how many residents they can train at one time. It comes down to much more of clinical sites and what clinical sites are available. So in those type of more hybrid-based programs, that's one of the beauties, is residency is non-exclusive. It's open to anybody and everybody who is willing to take that step to advancing themselves professionally. So in those programs, oftentimes you're really just trying to make yourself attractive to a future employer. And a lot of those things that I didn't mention are things that future employers may look. Your personality and how you interact in communication may be a little bit more important, I would say, in looking for that type of a position, as particularly if you're a new grad, most everybody kind of has, very similar experiences. So how you're going to interact with their patients and the type of feel that you give to somebody in your communication can be a really important thing. So.
Yeah, that's great advice on that, Brett. I really appreciate your take on that. I'd like to kind of flip the script a little and look at the other side of things, but what would you say are some of the pros and limitations of teaching in a residency or fellowship program?
Yeah, that's a great question, kind of flipping it to look at the other side, looking at the instructor side of things. That's one of the great benefits of going through residency or fellowship, is it will oftentimes open up those types of doors and opportunities for you in teaching and other professional opportunities that you may not be aware that they're available to you when you enter that program. So that's one of the cool things. And gosh, I had no idea what, some of my professional decisions in going through a residency and then a fellowship, I had no idea some of the doors that would open. So, I think one of the cool things about teaching in the Evidence in Motion program is that most of our faculty are adjunct faculty. And what's cool about that is you can still be a full-time clinician, or you can run a business, or you can have your main job. And because you're teaching into your specialty area and your passion that you're basically going and teaching on the weekends or in the online environment, everything that you do during the workday. So it's a fantastic way to, touch other physical therapists and help mentor them and bring them along. But then you're also, exponentially touching more patients. I think that's one of the cool things that I love about Evidence in Motion is their mission is really just to elevate physical therapy and occupational therapy professions in the healthcare system. And what better way to do that than elevate everybody's knowledge and training in their respective professions. So as far as the instructors go in being able to teach for EIM, I feel very blessed, and those opportunities in our organization are open to our fellowship students and graduates. In other programs, and again, more of your traditional programs, oftentimes there's more teaching opportunities for the residents. So I think those are some really cool things that are afforded to you when you do well in a program, and some of those opportunities will open up. But on the other side too, I've kind of neglected probably the most important place where teaching comes into play, and that's in the clinic. And mentoring residents and fellows that you're working alongside, that's probably the most valuable way to share some of your knowledge and skills and really learn from your residents and fellows. And that's an incredible opportunity as well that residency and fellowship graduates have, is being able to mentor other residents and fellows in the clinic. And that is really an important need too. We need more specialist certified therapists who can be mentors for orthopedic residents and for sports residents. So that is also a shortage, especially in specialty areas outside of orthopedics, is there's not enough mentors to go around for these residency programs. And that's oftentimes why residency programs can only take a few students at a time. So I think those are some of the benefits. As far as some of the limitations or some of the, I don't know what you'd call it, the disadvantages of teaching, there really aren't many. I mean, there's more time sacrifice, I would say. I mean, when you are involved in teaching, there's always prep time. There's always, more time dedicated to teaching that, is really not accounted for. So that can be one of the, maybe a hurdle for some. But, overall, I think the opportunity to teach and really, the opportunity to teach is a fantastic, way to further get involved with the profession.
Sure. No, I think you brought up a couple of good points there, Brad. So you kind of mentioned this a little bit in your prior answer, but I'm going to try to see if we can expand on it a little bit to give it a little bit more. But, Brett, what can we as PTs do, either going through the residency program or even just an outsider? What can we do if we're interested in teaching within a residency or fellowship program to make that happen?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I often get, at weekends and at conferences, etc. People are, curious about, how do I get more plugged in with a residency or fellowship program? So, gosh, there's a lot of ways, and I'm probably not the expert on this, but it really oftentimes comes down to who you know. And if you have been through residency or fellowship, the first place to start is to look back at your programs, because oftentimes programs are hiring their graduates back into teaching opportunities. Just because you've been ingrained in the system and you've gone through the training, and so now you're going to be able to, you're really kind of the best suited person to bring the next, wave of therapists through the program. So, that's the first and obvious way, is to just, get back in touch with your program and reestablish some of those relationships. If you're fortunate enough to be a graduate of a DPT program who has a residency or fellowship program, reaching back out to those schools as well. So really utilizing your, contacts to, to see where some of those opportunities may be. There is from time to time residency programs who are looking for faculty, and oftentimes they are putting notices out there through email communication with all of the other residency program directors. And so we get probably, one a week almost, with a position open somewhere, and it's something that they're pushing out to the residency or fellowship graduates of other programs to let them know, hey, this position is open. So I think the first step to being or wanting to get involved with a residency or fellowship program and in teaching for them is to first probably go through a residency or fellowship program, because that's going to provide you with the backing and the knowledge and experience of what goes on in a residency program. You often hear this in DPT education, right? Most, even adjunct faculty now are required to have their DPT in order to teach at the DPT level. So there's a certain part of that that just kind of makes sense. There's always rare exceptions to that when somebody has extensive experience, extensive training, and perhaps they're a little bit more, we'll call it experienced in the profession. And prior to residencies becoming more popular, oftentimes those people may, already have the credentials for that. So it's a tough question that, again, I'm not the expert on how to find those, but maybe that offers, one view on how somebody can get involved in teaching in a residency or fellowship program.
Yeah, Brett, you bring up a couple of really good points there. And I think, it's good for someone like me to hear that, because I never really considered teaching in a residency program, but it is something that I could maybe entertain in the future. And it's good to know that, I've been practicing 11 years now, and I still haven't ruled out doing a residency and or a fellowship. I wanted to do it right after I graduated, but life kind of got in the way, and I hit a couple speed bumps, and it just didn't take me down that route. But, it sounds like what you're saying is that it's still possible for somebody with 10, 15 years of experience to go through a residency and then maybe even parlay it into a teaching gig down the line. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, depending on the individual, that's where, perhaps a fellowship program may actually be a better fit, or, better suited for what they're trying to accomplish. So it really would come down to the individual, and it would depend a lot on the individual as to which route might be the best fit for them. But yeah, there's absolutely opportunities, even if you've been out and you're a more experienced clinician, to get involved in residency and fellowship education. It's really, having the, credentials to do so, and, applying for programs when programs are in need. So that's one thing to think about. The other thing is there are programs out there too who, use hired mentors too to provide mentorship in the clinics. So again, if you have those credentials, if you're an OCS certified therapist, that might be a unique service that you can provide, to a residency program, is mentorship. So you may have opportunities for, paid teaching within more of the clinical environment, in more of a one-to-one type of, teaching opportunity.
So Brett, in your opinion, kind of with, through residency and fellowship programs, and kind of even working, as an adjunct in that role, can you briefly talk about, and I realize this will vary between the individual and the program and such, but can you briefly kind of go into how the financial incentives to kind of participate in that role is, or AKA, what are the salary considerations within that?
Yeah, so are you asking specifically about the salary considerations for an instructor, and perhaps in more of an adjunct?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. That's a great question, and gosh, again, I'm probably not the expert on this, but I can certainly offer one view, and particularly from the adjunct side of things. So the beauty of being an adjunct instructor is you can still have a full-time job, and recently we kind of pulled some of our fellowship graduates. So EIM now has over close to 90 graduates. We're right at 89 graduates of our fellowship program, and we're about 10 years now with our program. But we recently kind of polled our graduates and asked them some of those financial questions of, what's been the financial impact on completing a fellowship program, because fellowship programs can be very expensive, even more expensive than residencies, and they can range, really from anywhere from 10,000 on up to 20 or more, 20,000 or more in cost. So that's a big, investment, and not everybody views that as an investment. So getting back to the question of, what are some of the financial incentives? Gosh, this varies from person to person and how much you're, willing to take on, how many courses you are teaching, because the pay is generally done on a per course basis, or we'll call it per opportunity basis. And so it can vary a lot from learner to learner. But what was really cool is that our fellowship students, we end up hiring back, 75+% of them into teaching opportunities, both in post-professional education as well as entry-level education. And within 2 years, our fellowship graduates on average made up the cost of their fellowship training. And I will point out too that most of our students go through the fellowship program. It usually takes them between 2 and 3 years to complete the fellowship program. So, really their investment of 2 or 3 years in, they almost get a return on their investment, 2 years out roughly on average. So, and I think that's a really kind of speaks to the fact that when you do a program like a residency or a fellowship, you really have to go into it thinking it's more of an investment versus a grudge purchase, right? Buying a car is a grudge purchase. It's something where you're not really going to ever see a return on the original investment, most likely. But when you're talking about your education, this is something that it's an investment. So the money you put in, you're likely to see out if you're taking on additional opportunities and really putting to work your new knowledge and information, and sharing your skills with others is what it really comes down to. So I think that's really important aspect to think about for anybody going into residency or fellowship training, that it is an investment.
Yeah, Brett, that's a great way to look at that, as looking at it as an investment. What are some other ways you think would be good ways to maybe leverage a residency or a fellowship in the real world of physical therapy and business?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I love that question because you can really look at it from two sides. You've got the business owner who's saying, well, why should I pay for a residency program? And then you have the student or the resident who's saying, well, why should I invest in the residency? So, what are some of the, long-term benefits? And so I love that question. So maybe first I'll answer it from the business side of things. And I think if, as a business owner, especially in private practice, private practices are oftentimes looking for, looking for therapists to fill their needs. As they grow and expand, they need more help. Oftentimes people may, move because life takes them in a different direction and they have openings. And of course, this happens at hospital systems as well. But particularly in the private practice sector, where there's maybe a little bit more leeway and decisions are made a little bit easier, a residency or being able to offer residency can oftentimes be a really nice benefit that you may offer to particularly a newer or less experienced therapist coming into your organization. Somebody who's particularly looking for an opportunity to continue to learn. I think a lot of new graduates with APTA's push for residency training and academic programs push for residency training, a lot of new graduates are looking for those types of opportunities. So as a business owner, if you can say, you know what, we offer a residency training, and in fact, here's some of the benefits, we'll provide you with this mentorship, that's something that's really attractive and lucrative to a new graduate physical therapist who is looking for that type of an opportunity. And then, of course, just like everything in life, nothing ever comes free. So the business owners typically are not covering the cost of the residency 100%. But there is some sacrifice, and they are maybe taking a little bit larger of that burden. The new graduate physical therapist really has two things they can give up, either money or time. And both of those can be very lucrative to the business owner. I work for an outpatient physical therapy clinic here in Washington, and we use residency training. And almost all of our new employees who come into our organization go through residency training. And it's a win-win all around. It makes us attractive to new students who are looking for that type of an opportunity. And typically how we structure this is either we lower the resident starting pay for that first year during residency. They're working fewer number of hours in the clinic, We're providing them with mentorship as well as covering the cost of their residency tuition. So for the business, it ends up almost being a budget neutral experience. And then for the student, they're taking a hit on the salary side of things, but they're getting this awesome experience of not having to work 40 hours in the clinic, having mentorship provided for them so they still kind of have a lifeline. And then they have this really dedicated didactics that are helping them further develop their skills in that specialty area. And then they owe nothing back to the business after the end of the residency. After the end of the residency, they can choose to go in a different direction, or if the residency experience went really well and the organization would like to offer them a full-time position, they're able to do that. So that's one way it oftentimes works. Another way is, like I mentioned, the student or the resident has two things they can give up: money or time. On the other side of things, they can give up time. So sometimes the organization's willing to front the entire bill for the residency, but the agreement is, well, we'll pay for your residency, but we'll need you to sign on for, call it, another year or 2 years after you graduate the residency program. And that way the business protects their investment, and they make sure they get a return on their investment. The resident is making a full salary, still maybe receiving a lot of those benefits, and is not paying for that residency particularly out of pocket. So that can be really lucrative to a company that's looking to hire new graduate physical therapists. Anecdotally, I think the other big problem with inexperienced physical therapists is they typically have a hard time communicating with different types of patients, and that oftentimes results in more cancellations and no-shows, and so larger number of lost visits, which ultimately affects the bottom dollar of the organization. And what I find is that when somebody does a residency, they're brought up to speed way faster. Their communication skills develop. They have evidence and research to hang their hat on. And what that ultimately results in is we see our residents have fewer number of lost visits. So their patients come in to see them. They're not canceling, they're not no-showing like they may with a inexperienced young clinician who is not going through formal education. So anecdotally, that can also be a huge downstream cost savings for a business in going through a residency program. And when I sell this, and I do a bit of selling, and it's not hard sell, it's just it's laying out the facts. I always point to Jason Rodagaro's published study in JOSPT. It was in February 2015, where he looked at focus on therapeutic outcomes, or is often referred to as photo outcomes, of non-residency or fellowship trained clinicians, residency trained clinicians, and fellowship trained clinicians. And just kind of the gist of that article was, fellowship trained clinicians had significant effects in their overall treatment efficiency. So they got their patients, better, faster, essentially. What was also interesting about that study is that non-residency or fellowship trained clinicians and residency trained clinicians really, weren't statistically different. But if you look at those two groups, you'll see that the non-residency trained group is far more experienced, almost 10 years, versus the residency trained group, which is your more younger clinicians in that study, and they're having the same outcomes. So I always kind of explain it to people as, when you do a residency, it's almost like a fast pass to being more or less a 5-year clinician. So a lot of those early on problems that we all have when we first enter the workforce kind of evaporate much faster, and that can also be really helpful. Looking at this from the other side of the coin, what are some of the advantages from the student? And again, from the student, you see a lot of those same advantages where they feel much more confident in the clinic, which ultimately results in fewer number of lost visits. Their performance is better. And when they graduate residency, oftentimes organizations are offering them raises in their salary, anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000 oftentimes. So that, going through a residency also has some advantages to the new graduate as well, just in overall confidence, as well as, perhaps some financial gains as well.
Yeah, Brett, I think those were a lot of good and interesting take on that, especially with that study that you kind of referenced in there. I think that was very helpful to hear. Brett, first of all, this has been a very enlightening and insightful discussion. I feel like I've definitely learned a couple new tidbits about, residency and fellowship and the process in general. And I thank you for that. And I hope our listeners gain some value from that as well. But, we like to always finish off each episode with this one question to each of our guests, as we're always very curious to hear what they think. The question is, if you could change one aspect of healthcare education, DPT or other healthcare education related, what aspect would you change, and how would you recommend changing it?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I feel like I've touched on this a few times throughout the episode here, and really it comes down to, I think, variability in our profession and in our practice patterns, and that all starts at entry-level education. And for the most part, entry-level education has become much more standard. CAPTE is very rigorous in their requirements of entry-level programs. You still see some variability, particularly in some of the clinical skills, manual therapy, and so on and so forth. And hopefully that continues to evolve to become more standard. But I really think the big, the black eye of our DPT education is the clinical internship aspect. It's almost as if, you go to school and you learn all of this great knowledge in the classroom. You learn all of this great knowledge in the classroom, and then the classroom learning kind of ends and you're kicked out to the clinics. And really you're placed in these clinics that, offer a wide variety of experiences, and how well prepared you are to treat patients in the clinic is largely depends on how good those clinical internship experiences were. And with large amount of variability during those clinical internship experiences, it makes it really challenging to move the profession forward with having more standardization in practice. So I think that's the biggest thing that needs to be fixed, if you will. And what I would love to see, most universities are still charging tuition dollars when the students are out in these clinical internships. And most of the time, the organizations taking these students are not receiving any financial benefits. And in fact, they probably take financial loss in having the students in lower productivity, etc. So I would love to see more standardization through that internship experience and process and really I probably have two things that I would love to see changed. Is number one is a standard curriculum that's delivered while the student is out in the internship. That really should be pushed through the university, but they need to have a standardized curriculum for each, clinical specialty area. So think of it as different modules. So when you're in orthopedic clinic, you're going through the orthopedic modules. That goes really through a lot of the foundations. And what better way than having your clinical instructor, clinical faculty person learn with the student through these standardized modules to help further standardize clinical practice. That to me seems like one of the easiest fixes. It's purely developing content and using and leveraging technology to push it out to the students while they're out in their clinical practice. And I will have to say, this is not my idea. Fortunately, I'm exposed to a lot of forward thinkers in our profession, with John Childs and several others. And for those maybe not aware too, EIM has a partnership with a entry-level program where we are playing a role in delivering some of these experiences while they're out in the clinical environment, really trying to create this standard of practice. So this is something that is being done currently at South College University, which is a program in Knoxville, Tennessee, and others. So I would love to see that go widespread across the profession. So that would be one of the big changes that I would like to see happen in clinical education.
Yeah, great take on that, Brett. I'd like to thank you so much for coming on the show tonight. It really, like Brandon said, it gave me a lot of insight to the topic of residency and fellowship. Do you think you could tell our audience a little bit about where they can find you online and on social media?
Yeah, first off, thank you both for having me on. Hopefully, some of this information was informative. Again, it's one perspective from one seat, but hopefully there was some little tidbits in there that will be helpful to somebody out there who's interested in residency and fellowship education. Best way to find me probably is through, I'm pretty reachable by email. So my email is bneilson@eimpt.com. Everybody always spells my last name incorrectly, so that's Neilson. And then my phone number is 210-526-1533. And then I'm also on Twitter at Brett Neilson DPT. And those are probably the three best ways to get a hold of me. And feel free to reach out if there's anybody. I'd love to connect and offer any other information or advice that I could to help somebody out.
Awesome, Brett. Well, thanks so much again for coming on, man. And, as a side note here, best of luck with everything with the new little one coming up, man. And hope everything goes well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you to you both, and I hope you have a nice night.
Thanks, you too. Thank you for attending class today, and we hope that you learned something and gained value from the content.
If you'd like to schedule office hours with us, feel free to add us on Twitter at HET Podcast, on Instagram, HET Podcast, on Facebook, the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast, and the homepage, healthcareeducationtransformationpodcast.com.
And for those of you following along in the syllabus, extra credit can be obtained by liking us, sharing us, and leaving a review.
Let's continue our journey up Mount Educational Success as lifelong learners.